Hello, everyone. I am Stephanie Owino. I'm the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and I'm also the co-chair for the DEI Committee for the Michigan ASLA chapter. Welcome to the Michigan ASLA Diverse Perspectives webinar featuring guest speaker, Manisha Kaul. The Diverse Perspective webinar series aims to highlight the work of minority designers and amplify diverse voices within the landscape architecture community. Before I begin, I'd like to share a few resources with you all. This event was put on by the Michigan ASLA DEI Committee. The DEI Committee aims to encourage, promote, and celebrate diversity, equity, and inclusion in our chapter and our profession. We focus on initiatives aimed at recruitment, retention, mentorship, training, outreach, events, and community discussions for our students, members, and communities. And this is inclusive of race, gender, class, ethnicity, culture, age, ability, and sexual orientation. So here on this slide, we have a couple of resources you guys can check out. You can check it via the link on here, or if you have any questions, you can email me at dei@michiganasla.org. So next, I'll give a brief bio about Manisha. Leading design workshop Chicago studio, Manisha is deeply passionate about creating synergies in the public realm through an equitable, resilient, and regenerative approach to design. Creatively using the site and its environment, she has successfully guided federal, public, and institutional clients through complex planning and innovative site design projects. Trained as an architect and a landscape architect, recipient of a gold medal in India and a Creative Achievement Award in Landscape Architecture at Penn State University, Manisha's career of over 20 years includes projects in the United States, Middle East, Africa, and India. Member of Eli chapter of Lambda Alpha International and a full member of the Urban Land Institute, she currently serves on ULI's University Development and Innovative Product Council. And now I will pass it over to Manisha to share more about the AIDS Garden Chicago project. If you can begin screen sharing your PowerPoint and begin your presentation. As a reminder, attendees, please submit your questions in the Q&A feature. We will answer the questions at the end of the session.
Thanks, Stephanie, and welcome everybody who's joined this evening. Michigan ASLA, thank you for inviting me to share my perspectives on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the public realm this evening. I'm extremely honored to be the first of the list of many, hopefully in the future, that will share their perspectives on equitable public realm design. And today I'm thrilled to share with you Chicago's soon to be added newest public space, the AIDS Garden Chicago. But before I discuss the project, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the conversation about embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in our public spaces should not be a choice anymore. It should be natural and integral, and an integral expression of the space. And the discussion around the role of parks, our parks and open spaces, and really being similar to pop-up stages for public discourse is gaining momentum, and we're all glad to see that happen. While the complexity and the nuanced facets of civic values that are being discussed and debated within our public parks and open spaces are definitely a result of changing times, and we hope that the bar keeps moving in the positive direction. Unfortunately, with the COVID-19 pandemic having disrupted our public access to some of these recreational amenities of parks and open spaces in Chicago, this fabric that really knits our neighborhoods together is being tested to its hilt. In much of our, in our beloved parks, we're seeing cultural, civic, environmental, and aesthetic values of Chicagoans coming together in very opportune ways. That being said, I wanted to begin by giving you a glimpse of the transformation that Chicago Park District engaged design workshop in our Chicago office to execute. The image on the left is a sketch of a conceptual proposal prepared by a member of Chicago Park District for the future AIDS garden, and the sketch on the right is where we are in the process. The Park District wanted design workshop to develop design for a garden that would memorialize the early days of HIV epidemic and honor those who continue to fight against the disease today. While the concept had some things going for it, it was definitely a design idea that was close to the champion, Alderman Tom Tunney, and a garden that was championed by him and a number of other community organizations. So for one, the community was excited about this future garden. So that takes care of a good portion of it. The central attraction of the garden is a 30-foot sculpture designed by the late artist and activist Keith Haring. That was being donated by the Keith Haring Foundation to the Chicago Park District through the efforts of Alderman Tunney and the support from Chicago Parks Foundation. So there was the will of the community, a champion, and a focal piece of art already in place. Yes, we understood the task, but did we really? Our process always started with defining, always starts with defining the problem. So we did that, and as we were defining the goals, the program, and evolving the design, we realized that the plan significantly changed from the concept that we had started with. It was sort of an evolution of the design that kind of at various stages in design did sort of raise some concern. Were we going far away from the design that the community had already accepted? And then we started looking at the bigger picture and looking at what are the elements and design ideas and goals that we're really embedding that the community cares for. And so if we were doing that, then we were doing good by the design evolution. So it gave us an opportunity to also embed diverse perspectives in the development of the plan. And we're at a stage now where the execution is really on the horizon, hopefully beginning spring. So what was the dilemma here? The 2.5-acre site is located north of Chicago along the magnificent shoreline of Lake Michigan, just south of Belmont Harbor in Lincoln Park. And more importantly, the site is actually the original location of Belmont Rocks, a space where the local LGBTQ community gathered between the 1960s and the 1990s as an expression of joy, celebration, togetherness, and really celebrated this space. So the location of this garden had real significance. So as we do by understanding, after understanding the dilemma, as I mentioned earlier, we had a number of partners in the process: Chicago Park District, the Keith Haring Foundation, Chicago Parks Foundation, Alderman Tom Tunney's office, and numerous community groups and organizations that were championing this garden. And so, we tried to pick on what were the key things at the beginning that our conceptual plan really called for. There was some semblance of an axis, there was identification of certain access points to the garden, and coupled with that, we tried to understand what were the environmental conditions that were within the garden. So, noise highlighted here in blue from North Lakeshore Drive being right adjacent to the site being one. And of course, as you can see, maybe a good 1/3 of the site is within the 100-year floodplain. And of course, there are the horizons that we're looking at. And so while there were some constraints, there were also some opportunities that could start to inform how the concept evolved from its initial expression. So what was the dilemma here? It's always, what we try to do at Design Workshop is always identify what is the problem, and then how can we solve that problem. And we realize once we articulate the problem, then solutions and things that really can address some of the larger picture thinking can be incorporated and addressed within the design. And the design can stand on its own. So our dilemma was how we could embed healing, inspiration, celebration, and more importantly, community inclusion into this garden space. And our thesis to this question was that the garden can definitely include areas designed for reflection, for hope, for education, for healing, and for celebration through very careful attention to where the project is located, how it is oriented in space, what is the scale of different spaces, what are the textures we're trying to achieve, and what is the color that we're trying to celebrate here. So with that in mind, we worked with the client, the Chicago Park District and the Chicago Park District and the foundation to define the goals. And at every point in the process, all the stakeholders were part of this design evolution. And so that made it all the more important for it to be really grounded in things that the community really cared for. So we collectively identified these goals, that it was important for this space to be one that could be a space for reflection. It needed to be a space, either memorial or celebration, depending how you look at it from a perspective of the user. It definitely needed to give a sense of hope, and of course be educational for the community while imbuing a sense of community, healing, and inclusion. So with that in mind, and these great goals always at the back of our mind, we started looking at how we can evolve and extend the design narrative to really encompass and imbue all these different characteristics and goals that we as a team identified. So next came aligning the program with the goals. Because of course, it's only a 2.5 acre garden space, but it had so many different program elements that the park district and the community wanted included in it, that it was important to start to understand what are these different program elements that are, that we can include. And then what that means from a physical space perspective. So there was the need for a sculpture lawn, which could also double up as an event space. There was the desire to have a community garden space, of course, that had its various different elements associated with it, whether questions about whether it needed to be an edible garden, a medicinal garden. It, of course, needed some facilities and some hookup for water, and of course, donor recognition as part of it, because at the end of the day, if you can't really raise money to build these public spaces, then they don't become a reality and they sit on the shelf. So in addition to that, there was need for individual smaller group spaces. And there were a number of items, elements that were, discussed within the group. That does it need to have a grove that people could really sit down and reflect under shade? Did it need seating? What donor recognition can we include in here? And in addition to that, there needed to be a flexible event space for about 300 people. And there were entrances. So we talked about how we could use entrances off of the lakefront trail as well as Lake Michigan and incorporate small plazas that had mobility options like bike racks and donor recognition included within the spaces. And of course, all of this needed to be bound together through a circulation that also these spaces could start to tie in temporary exhibit spaces. So a lot of ask for this small garden space. So we started kind of going over and looking at what could be inspirational imagery for some of these different spaces. How would we organize our sculpture lawn? Did it need to be the sculpture in the middle, in the lawn space around it, or was it lawn space with sculpture at one end of it? And we looked at various opportunities that the space really provided us. What could the community garden space look like? Was it formal? Was it informal? Was it more focused on being part of the circulation, or was it more of a focal point within the entire garden that would make sense for it? In addition to that, we looked at the smaller individual group spaces. We did initially talk about, the ginkgo grove as being a potential opportunity, and I'll talk a little bit later about why ginkgo and why not another tree. And of course, the need for seating, for donor recognition, and then about the flexible open space. It needed space for a tent, needed space for deliveries, etc., for bigger gatherings. And then the entry trail plazas, like what could the trail front entrance and the lakefront entrance, how could we distinguish between the two? What might be entry markers? What do they need for bike racks? And could all of these be put together as combined donor recognition? And then the circulation. There was need identified to provide spaces for temporary exhibit spaces within these different smaller individual garden opportunities. And then, what kind of plantings were appropriate? Were they educational? Could wayfinding be part of this system as well? And of course, improve lighting for safety and for people. So then, we identified all these goals. There was these different parameters. And then the question was, how do we embed this big ask of the program elements and the lofty goals that we were trying to accomplish within the project with design evolution? And so, it was very simple at the beginning. We started, as every designer would do, started identifying, spatially, what are these with different spaces? What could the sculpture identified here in the star, was that the focal point? Was it, were the spaces aligned along the focal point? And how was the circulation pattern identified in red here? How was that really weaving these spaces and joining them together? Because the overall area in Lincoln Park was much larger than this, and our garden was a small part of it. So how were we positioning these different elements so that they could not just be spatially identifiable, spatially relevant, but also aim in really supporting the goals of the project? So then we had a couple of options. The first option that I shared here was a way of including spaces and having the pedestrian linkage really connect them on the outside. And then there was another option that, okay, well, maybe the circulation network really needs to go through these spaces to really weave them together. And so we came up with very quick sketches with the client, and sort of started to identify where could planting be, what might be these different spaces that, whether they were flexible spaces or active spaces, or they were just visual spaces. And then, of course, the client, you give them 3 options, they always want the 4th one that is a combination of different options. So the client wanted us to look at the celebration space and the space around the sculpture be one that really had some reflection in what the climate was telling us, what the horizon was telling us, and then yet have a very sinuous network of the walkway connect these different spaces. So the 4 diagrams you see here, done by my colleague, Sophia, really clearly illustrates, how we were evolving these spaces and trying to connect them. And then coming up with a design that really looked at, providing the sculpture at not the center, but offset from the center in this ellipse of the central lawn space. The rays from the center were really reflective of and wanted to imbibe the concept of looking into the horizon and the sunrise, and how the pathway system and the patterns of the pathway system really accentuated very subtly these rays in the paving. And of course, there was a larger landing at one entrance off of Lakefront Trail and a smaller entrance off of the parking lot. And then there was a connection also offered to the Lakefront access trail. So this is the plan as it stands currently, with the main entrance to the AIDS Garden off of the Lakefront Trail. It presents a perennial garden of native plants alongside a cluster of ginkgo trees right at the entrance. It's almost like it's a mini presentation of what is to come within the garden itself. Now, there is a combination entry sign and a donation wall with a dedicated bench right at this entrance, with bicycle racks in a gracious serpentine pathway leading the visitor to the celebration lawn at the end. A custom design limestone ledge is integrated into the seating area and is reminiscent of the original Belmont rocks, since none of those rocks are really remaining. So we wanted to bring in and connect the new design to not just the idea of the people, but the idea of some of the elements that were critical to forming and giving value to the space in those days. As visitors approach, there are planted berms of magnificent bunch grass that enclose the main entryway, and they frame this view of this focal point in the distance of the 30-foot tall Keith Haring self-portrait sculpture. The curvy pathway that emanates from this entrance really ends in an oval composition around the sculpture. It defines the primary circulation route that also unifies the diverse spaces of the garden. A row of maples and colored concrete bands in a recognizable rhythm, really, and these recognizable bands are connecting the temporary art exhibits, which will come in the future. And it is our hope that the community and the artists in the community can get engaged in really providing their own mark to this space and really making it their own through various art installations and temporary art and permanent art installations within this garden. And these exhibits are also intended to fulfill the education mission of the garden. A distinct paving pattern extends to the other garden areas to engage and guide the visitors. At the junction of the main serpentine path and the entrance from the parking area is a space that we're calling the Unity Garden. And adding color and movement through season, the planting design of the Unity Garden really draws from the native deciduous and evergreen shrub ornamental prairie grasses brought to life with very colorful perennials. Mature existing trees form the understory, while flowering witch hazel will fill the understory of these mature trees. A rich planting palette is designed to attract birds and pollinators while responding to specific climatic and soil conditions being in such close proximity to the lake. So the area is really flat, it's cool, and it's windy. So these gardens will be planted by and maintained under the direction of volunteer gardeners from across the city and really imbue a feeling of healing through unity. The Reflection Grove, which is highlighted by these magnificent ginkgo trees, defines an area of the garden that's really well suited for quiet reflection. And it transforms the existing lawn area into a very intimate grove of ginkgo trees planted 20 feet apart in center, acting as a canopy and a lush foliage. The ginkgo trees were very thoughtfully selected for their resilience, aesthetic benefit, and cultural anecdotes. And ginkgo biloba, the species that we're proposing here, really offers a perfect symbology of recovering from hardship and promotes a cultural narrative of healing, and hence the tree. It also offers a very strong visual interest with its simple, deep green fan-like form in the spring and summer, and a magical gold blanket of leaves that drop in a single day in the fall. And visitors of all abilities can enjoy the shade offered by the tree canopy, with wheelchair accessible areas interspersed with more naturalistic boulder seating. So the celebration, as you emerge from the heavily shaded reflection grove, there is a celebration space, which is the forecourt of this, the Keith Haring sculpture that provides a backdrop to the 30-foot tall sculpture. This landscape section is deliberately left unprogrammed so that the visitor has the freedom and flexibility to experience the space in a passive or active manner, however they may choose. And historically, the Belmont Rocks was not only an area to sunbathe for the LGBTQ community, but it was also a liberating environment that allowed stigmatized individuals to really liberate themselves in the daylight. So to celebrate that proud spirit within the landscape, decorative paving bands really symbolizing sun's rays radiate from the center of the sculpture into the perimeter walk, creating a very celebratory environment in a subtle way. This is a view from the entry looking into the ginkgo grove, the reflection space. And there are seating opportunities for people of all abilities within this ginkgo grove. And this is an image of the Keith Haring sculpture and the oval in the lawn space, a celebratory space that is surrounding it, where people, as you can see, can have the flexibility to enjoy it however they please, they desire to enjoy the space. And this is the current situation. The sculpture, the 30-foot tall sculpture, was actually installed last November. And while the garden was scheduled to be constructed in 2020, as we're all aware, COVID-19 has really stopped some of our projects from proceeding at the rate that we would all like them to proceed. But the goal is that in spring, that the garden around this beautiful sculpture, this happy sculpture, really comes into play. A view of the sculpture and the magnificent skyline of Chicago in the backdrop. And always remembering that reflection, celebration, hope, education, community, healing, and inclusion really need to be an integral part of all the designs that we do for the public space. And so AIDS Garden Chicago is now well poised to be a successful public space, one that will bring together a diverse coalition of partnerships in support of this one-of-a-kind Chicago landmark. It's a garden for all, a space for reflection, celebration, hope, education, community, healing, and most of all, inclusion. Well, thank you all for listening to me. I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Yep, if anyone has any questions, just submit it in the chat or using the Q&A feature. I just had a brief question about the sculpture. Like, what was the concept behind the sculpture?
The sculpture, you may have seen smaller versions of the sculpture actually have been installed in other places. But the sculpture is really a self-reflection of Keith Haring, and it's produced by his foundation and was donated to the Chicago Park District. So it's supposed to be a self-reflection of Keith.
Mm-hmm. Cool. We have one question here. Is there anything you've done to protect the sculpture from graffiti?
We do have some signage that's going to be installed around the sculpture when the garden, as part of the garden implementation, and we also have a planting area that's around the sculpture to prevent people from actually stepping onto the sculpture. But other than that, we have not had any specific input on what goes on the sculpture. It's just really part of the Keith Haring Foundation and their sort of design and implementation that has been the key here.
Another one, what is the relationship between the park and the waterfront?
There is access to, if I can go back here, there will be an access to the waterfront from the park. And throughout the park, there are strategically located natural seating areas that will have open view of the park. So there is a slight berm here. So there we've kind of accounted for people being able to sit on top of those rocks akin to Belmont rocks in the past and be able to look into the horizon and the lake. But there is a physical access to the lake. And you can see this is the existing access that we're trying to retain.
Okay. Next question. Can you speak a little more about some of the program requirements as they relate to the history of the site and the intent for the new space?
Could you repeat that one more time?
Can you speak a little more about some of the program requirements as they relate to the history of the site and the intent for the new space?
Sure. With the history that I described of this exact location being the location of the Belmont Rocks, where the LGBTQ community really gathered in the 60s to the 80s, one of the key goals in our project was really to make sure that the space and the garden design and how it evolved really reflected the hopes, the struggles of the community thus far. So it did, there was a definitive mandate to make sure that it was an inclusive space. And then we started talking about, like, what does this inclusive space, what should it be? Should it be a more subtle space, a more space for reflection? Or should it be a space where you can really express yourself and enjoy? And what we concluded with at the end of that process was that it needed to be both. And so there needed to be space where you could have an opportunity for reflection, and there needed to be a space where you could express yourself and celebrate, so that it's not about just memorializing, but it is an active sort of use space where people can express themselves the way they want. And that being sort of the genesis of the different spaces within the garden, which was really our way of sort of assigning use and character and program to a sort of nebulous idea.
Mm-hmm. Next two questions relate to public engagement and the public engagement process. What were some of the community engagement outreach challenges you faced while working on this process or project?
Yes, we did not, as part of this process, have a extended community engagement process. And that process had already happened when, with the first diagram, the conceptual plan that was developed by the Park District, that process had already happened. But what did happen during our process was that at definitive stages during the process, the plan was shared with the different community organizations and stakeholder groups that had been part of the original project. So while there was no specific public meetings for this particular phase of the plan, it had already happened in the past. So it was already part of the thinking and acceptance that, you know, we want a garden space that can be tended by local volunteers. We want a space that, you know, can that can be a space for reflection, can be a space for expression. So all that was already funneled into the design.
Nice. Next question. Okay, very inspiring presentation and design solution. If you could meet your younger self starting her career, what advice would you have for her as a designer?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? That wasn't very clear.
If you could meet your younger self starting her career, what advice would you have for her as a designer?
The advice that I would have for a young designer in me would be to always follow my instinct and to always follow what my heart says is right. and always try to find a greater meaning that can be grounded in your design, because otherwise it's almost forced and it's never successful. So that's what I would advise me maybe 25 years back.
Yeah, I know even like me as a emerging professional, it's sometimes hard when you're, trying to understand things and learn things, but also like second guessing yourself all the time. So definitely good advice for everyone, should I say. Next question is, was the park design and construction funded by the Chicago Parks Department or a different donation grant? And was the funding stalled due to COVID? And has that had an effect for the design at all?
So the funding actually is coming from a number of diverse avenues. There's some funding from Alderman Tunney's office. There is some funding from natural resources. There is some funding from Chicago Park District. And there is some funding from the Chicago Parks Foundation through donorship. So I unfortunately, since the project is in bid right now and they haven't selected a bidder yet, so I can't really talk about what the original funding, original scope and estimate was. An opinion of cost was for the construction. I'm unable to share that, but I have to tell you that it was a very, very small one, considering, other parks of similar sizes in the city. The funding was partially stalled due to COVID, but not completely. We are hopeful that in spring, all the funding will be in place to implement this garden.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next question, was diversity and inclusion important in the project proposal process before your firm was hired?
Yes, it was an important part of the project before we were hired. However, I think in the initial conceptualization of the plan, and this is purely my opinion and, obviously subject to agreement or not, but the plan that came out of the conceptual process, while it had all the elements that it included, I think it did not have the sort of expression of and a process of how you would go on expressing all these different goals. So diversity and inclusion, just by the nature of the garden and the memorial nature of it, was definitely meant to be inclusive, because that was the entire genesis. And I think during the process, Alderman's office, kept in very close communication with the community groups that wanted to have a say in how this process and the design evolves.
Okay, that was our last question on the list. So what advice would you give to students interested in working on DEI focused projects?
The first advice I would give is be involved in your community, know what matters to the community and how you can really push the envelope of expression and integration of diversity and equity in your project design, and always be an advocate for it. Never let this important criteria go by the wayside, because if we don't champion for it, nobody will. And so I think we need to be active participants in this conversation. You almost have to treat it like it has to be done now, or it had to be done yesterday, and why haven't we done it?
Okay. How has being a person of color affected or guided your career path?
Um, I have to be honest in saying that I actually, my philosophy in life is to kind of focus on what I can do and what I can do to affect change. And I think that has guided me throughout my career. And I have fortunately, been really fortunate to have been involved in projects that have a wide-ranging impact, sometimes impact on the environment and how I've been able to champion the cause of the environment, to public spaces, in public realm design. So I've kind of been extremely lucky and fortunate in having the opportunity along the way to have the opportunity to affect some change.
How has your upbringing and training in India affected your work in the US?
I think, I am the person that I grew up in my surroundings. I came from a small town in the foothills of the Himalayas. And my you know, first introduction to landscape was really through Mughal and Persian garden design that I had taken for so granted when I grew up, because we were in a small hamlet protected by the Himalayas, really not connected to the world that much, and not even realizing an impact that we as people were having on the natural resources and the water quality of fast moving streams and clear waters around us. And so I think that was really my first introduction to nature. And then my my parents had a lot to do with how I really approach my work ethic and how I carry on my life on a day-to-day basis. And especially my mother, who was always, always told me that, you can do anything. We came from a small place where not many opportunities existed for women, especially not in architecture or landscape architecture, because I came to landscape architecture through the route of architecture, as do many people from India. And so her strength in really facing life and being a professional mother of 3 kids and in small places and really telling your kids that there is nothing that you can't do, I think has guided how I've evolved as a person over the years.
That was actually one of the next questions. How did you find landscape architecture? And then as a follow-up, how did it help you land your current role currently?
Sure. So I found so in the place that I grew up, I think there were only 2 other people before me, or 3 other people before me, that had sort of delved into architecture. And so our opportunities were fairly limited. So I really wanted to create something. And I knew that I had more of a sort of artistic, maybe not artistic, but thinking a more design oriented brain than I had an engineering oriented brain. Much to my dismay, when I landed up in architecture school, I realized it was as much engineering as it was design. But I did, kind of in our architecture program in Mumbai, where I went to school. They really taught landscape in a couple of semesters, and it was generally about plants, about what grows around you. And then I started working in New Delhi, and suddenly a project landed on my desk that was it was a PUD with lots of amenities, public amenities, and I realized at that time, I really didn't know enough about how to design outdoors. I had gained some confidence in designing, buildings and the interiors of buildings, but I had no clue about landscape. And it was really my quest to learn more about landscape in that manner that I went back to school and did my master's School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi, one of the foremost institutions for postgraduate studies in India. And it was a very fast track program. It was like a year and a half. They crammed 5 years of undergraduate information in 3 to 4 semesters. And it almost felt like a crash course. And, I was very happy and very happy with how, what I was learning, but I still felt like I knew the design aspect of how to articulate thoughts and concepts into physical designs, but I really didn't know much about the research and why things are the way they are. Why do our plants grow the way they do? What does soil have to do with it? What is how we think about researching large scale, projects or elements that affect landscape architecture, whether it is environment, whether it is water, whether it is stormwater, whether it is soils or biodiversity. How does that impact? And it was, and I was really interested in knowing more about stormwater and how to really utilize this resource in the landscape. And so I came to the United States after doing my master's in India and did another master's at Penn State in watershed stewardship, where I really started to understand, that water knows no boundaries. And therefore, that was sort of really the beginning of my learning in landscape architecture. And I'm hoping that, I continue to learn till the last day that I practice.
I hear that. That's real. What factors do you consider most often when planning for inclusive projects as such?
I think it's really important to identify, firstly, who are you designing the project for? And why is it important to design the project for them? Because at times, and most of the times in public projects, it's not just important to think about the design and about materials. It's important to think about what benefit does your project bring economically to the area that you're designing it in. Because unless you're looking at a balanced view of integrating economic development with aesthetic values, with a community support and community impact, with the environmental considerations, I think it's lacking all the critical considerations. So those should be really, really integrated into design to embed equality, equity, and more importantly, access to public spaces. With our new sort of environment that we are in nowadays with the pandemic, it's becoming more and more clear that outdoors spaces are so critical to our health and well-being, and how we're promoting access of these public spaces to the people that are challenged and the people that really need access to these spaces. It's really important consideration in the design and the development of the project.
Great. What inspires you about landscape architecture? Our favorite question.
I think it's our ability and our responsibility to affect change that really inspires me. I mean, it's not important to say that we can do it. I think it's important to know that we will do it. And that's what we're here to do, is to really affect change for our environment and the people that matter the most, so that we're leaving for our future generations projects and an environment that was better than what they inherited. So what we inherited. So if even if I'm able to affect 1% change in making a place better, it's 1% more than none. So, so I think that's what makes me take every day, and really want to keep embracing and continuing on with the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just thinking about landscape architecture, so many routes that you can go, different areas you can specialize in. So that's the great thing about our profession, which kind of leads us into our next question. What do you look forward to for the future of the profession? It's a lot of great conversations that we've had over this year. So
I think the future is bright, and it's bright because I feel like we're more involved today, and we're more we're openly talking about issues within our social fabric that has the ability to really impact real change. So I feel like the future of our profession is bright, because it can be nothing other than bright, since we have the responsibility to really shape our public spaces and our public realm for people that need it the most.
Well, I have my own personal question. I know you talked a little bit about your daughter's birthday today, but how do you balance your work life and your home life? And then how has it affected change related to COVID with everyone working from home this year?
Yeah, it's my daughter's birthday today. She hasn't stopped talking about it for the last few months leading up to this day. And it's been challenging to kind of balance home life with all the work from home and the schooling that is happening online. But between my husband and I, we're trying to, on a daily basis, if you want to know the reality, it's almost like a firefighting situation, and we're constantly changing places to make sure that she is getting the attention that she needs at this age, to really learn. And it's been challenging, but I think it's also made us realize the importance of family, the importance of staying healthy, and the importance of flexibility and new ways of doing things. So I think in some ways it's opened up sort of new avenues and new ways of quickly and in a very expedient way learning things, learning how to take all that you do, including community engagement, online. And we had to do it for several projects where we were planning on going on a community meeting in 2 weeks, and then it had to be all online. So very quickly understanding and learning, which I think taught us adaptability and perseverance and all of those other good qualities that we all strive for. So it's been challenging, but it's also been rewarding, spending more time with family.
Yeah. Good. Well, I'm happy to hear that. When do you say happy birthday to her, and is your daughter getting a puppy this year?
Oh my goodness. I have, she asked, the thing is she asked for 2 things. You give her one, she asked for 2, says, I want a dog and a cat. I'm like, okay. Unfortunately, we travel so much or used to travel up until the recent situation with work that I wasn't sure that I could actually she's 6 years old today. So I wasn't sure that she'd actually be helping me take care of the puppy. So I have convinced her that when she's 10 years of age, we'll be getting both. So I've kind of delayed the situation for a few years, but I am looking forward to when she quickly turns 10 so that we can have new additions to our family.
That'll be right around the corner.
Yep.
So one of our last, have you found inspiration from Muhammad Shahir? Sorry if I'm not saying that correctly. I apologize for that. In India, if so, how have you applied your inspiration in this context?
Professor Shahir was really my first teacher in landscape architecture. And I think what I really learned from him was an ability to understand and express what was important in design and how to start thinking about your outdoor spaces in terms of whether it was program, whether it was who they were for. And I really hold him in great regard. I hold him in great regard.
Respect that. All right, well, if we don't have any further questions, I just want to say, Manisha, we thank you so much for being our first guest speaker for our Diverse Perspectives webinar series. If anyone has any further questions, you can feel free to contact me via dei@michiganasla.org, or you can find our information on our webpage at michiganasla.org, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We want to make sure that you all know we have a lot in store for 2021, so look forward for that information soon.
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be part of this, the first series, and so is my daughter here. Thank you all, and good luck to all of you. Keep on the good work.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thanks.